No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you love true crime or comedy, celebrity interviews or news, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue. And guess what? Now you can call them on your auto insurance too with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. It works just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. Get your quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
It feels like technology is just happening really quickly and happening to us.
That's Carissa Carter, a designer, geoscientist, and academic director at the Stanford d.school.
Algorithms aren't just tracking what we're doing, they're actually changing how we respond to the world.
And that's Scott Doorley, writer, designer, and creative director at the Stanford d.school. Carissa and Scott are co-authors of the new book, Assembling Tomorrow, which diagnoses the grave prospect that we live in a world of runaway design. And in response, they offer an alternative vision.
Maybe the motivation of design should be to bring things together and not sort of disrupt and tear things apart.
All coming right up.
Support for this show comes from the Rabbis Go South podcast. Imagine 16 American rabbis jailed for acting on their beliefs. The Rabbis Go South is a thrilling 7-part narrative podcast that brings to life the real story of Jewish-Black solidarity in St. Augustine, Florida during the Civil Rights Movement. Discover what happened when the rabbis answered MLK's call. Presented by the Hub and Spoke Expo. Find The Rabbis Go South on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. When you invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. Or so our guests today remind us. We live in a world they insist of runaway design. We are failing to give an account for the consequences of our creations. We fail to take seriously the consequences of our human designs in the now, but also the consequences for the future. Insufficient attention, for example, was given to the potential consequences of the Industrial Revolution. Just a few centuries later, we are both victims and victimizers of devastating climate change and a mass extinction of species. Or more recently, social media, presumably designed to facilitate relationships, has instead become a key player in social hostility and partisanship. Or more personally, our phones, which become tools of more general use and application, and thus really great at helping us, say, navigate from one place to another, actually shrinks the hippocampus in our brains. Our guests today are Scott Doorley and Carissa Carter. Carissa is a designer, geoscientist, and the academic director at the Stanford d.school, and Scott is a writer, designer, and the creative director at Stanford d.school. Together, they are the co-authors of the new book, Assembling Tomorrow, A Guide to Designing a Thriving Future. They offer a sobering diagnosis and a potentially liberating prescription. They help us reimagine the ways our design and technology may precipitate perilous harm to a degree we are utterly failing to consider. And they reimagine the ways that design and technology might better facilitate true human goods. Here's our interview. Welcome, Carissa and Scott.
Thanks for having us, Lee.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, delighted to have you guys with us. Since we've got kind of 3 academics here on the call, I think I want to indulge a little bit of intellectualism in my response to your book and say, I really, really very much like it.
That's the kind of intellectual response we very, very, very much like.
It's clearly you know your stuff. It's
yeah,
clear.
That's right. No, it's a beautiful book just physically in the way it's been designed and the way it's laid out. It's just a great book, I think, as far as from just a number of areas. I can imagine creatives loving this book. I mean, obviously you're writing for designers, but creatives of any sort loving the book. There's all sorts of philosophical considerations that are raising and kind of questions about society. It's just a wonderful book, so thank you for the book.
Thanks for appreciating it.
Yeah. So let's begin with the way you frame your understanding of one of the great problems facing contemporary world, namely runaway design. So tell us what you mean by runaway design.
Yeah, we talk about today's day and age being one of runaway design, and you can think about that a little bit like you think of a runaway train. So if you envision a runaway train, it's speeding down the tracks, you can't pull the brake, and it might crash. There might be a spill or some sort of destruction when it does finally come to a halt. Now, the thing with a runaway train is that we see it. We know it's run away, and we see the harm that it's caused. In today's runaway design world, the track's invisible, the train's invisible, right? So we are building with these technologies like AI, like blockchain, like synthetic biology that are very, very powerful. And their development and what we're building with them is speeding along tracks that we can't quite see until something has gone wrong. And it's really hard to keep up when it feels like technology is just happening really quickly and happening to us. And it's a moment that makes us feel really unsettled, but also, even though it's a runaway design world, we know that we have a lot of agency as individuals, as communities, to build a positive future within it.
Scott, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think the one thing to add is that these technologies are fundamentally different in that they change after we make with them. So an old material, a traditional material like wood or, even prior programming, you create it, it goes out into the world. It might shift, it might decay, it might not function as you thought, but it pretty much goes unchanged. These technologies like AI and synthetic biology, which we call artificial evolution, they change after we make them. That's not necessarily bad or good. It just requires a different approach to working with these things and also absorbing them as somebody who's a consumer.
So in some ways, I suppose you're dealing with an older problem prior to the kind of technological moment in which we find ourselves. So even with the Industrial Revolution, for example, you point to the ways in which there's design that people don't foresee the sort of problems that are going to arise with that. And then you have today development, design work where, again, we know that same dynamic is going to happen. And yet it seems to be all the more acute in its potential problematic state because precisely what you just said, Scott, because the designs themselves, the products themselves change in ways that we can anticipate. So expound upon maybe this is an old problem in its contemporary state. It's all the more problematic.
Yeah, it's a little, as Carissa was saying, it's a little harder to see. The effects actually come more quickly. So we've been chatting with folks and have an example where if you think about the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't until about the 1980s that people started really getting serious about global warming, climate change. They were calling it the greenhouse effect. That's more than 100 years after the things that created that effect went into the world. Now we have people worried about social media, where the fundamental shift in social media toward algorithmic distribution was about 10, 12 years ago. And now we're seeing the effects within 4 to 6 years, and now we're worried about them. So the effects are coming faster, and they're also equally as obtuse. So a lot of people don't even see the necessarily causal impact of social media on, say, teen mental health. We can only prove sort of the correlation between the timing of those things. We haven't completely proved that they're causally impacting each other. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that they are, but it's a little bit harder to prove and a little bit quicker to happen.
Carissa?
I'll also add that as humans, as makers, we are great at getting excited at the possibilities as to what might be, but we are way less great at predicting what might go wrong and talking about that from the get-go. That's not how our capitalist society is built either, right? We are made to build and sell, and my next widget's going to be the next big thing, and it's going to be fantastic. But it would take a big culture shift to be able to talk through, here are some of the ways that this has potential to harm people, the planet, whether it's 1, 10, 5, 100 years down.
Yeah. Carissa, as you said on this metaphor of the runaway train, that there are these sorts of tracks that are invisible to us. So part one then turns to these sorts of what you call intangibles, that there are these realities and forces at work, powers at work that we often cannot see or are insufficiently attentive to. The first one being connections, where one thing leads to another. So unpack that one for us.
Yeah, connections is really about how if you take any item in the world. And it's really easy to start with a thing, a product, something like holding a glass or a telephone here, or even a book. You can figure out how it's connected to everything else on multiple layers. Like, for example, I've got a cell phone here, an iPhone. That's a physical product that has digital products on it. And that is connected. It enables any number of experiences to happen in the world. You can have a video call with somebody on the other side of the world. That was designed. This phone is embedded in any number of systems too, right? Like, I have an AT&T phone plan and I'm a cog in that system. It decides where I get service and where I don't. And if I want an app, I get that at an app store, right? Like, there's rules for how you can upload your work to that app store and pull applications down from it. So we've got products connected to experiences, connected to systems. There's technology that powers all of that. The autocorrect technology, if you were to text message me, the name Carissa isn't often in the Western canon of names, and it'll autocorrect to carrot or carcass, right? And I guarantee if somebody else is listening and they have one of these names too, you know what your autocorrect name is,
Yes.
right? Because somebody designed the data set.
Mine is a misspelling of my name.
There you go, right? Like, but it learns, right? It learns after you correct it enough, right? And so that like learning was designed too. So the reality is that everything from our data and what's in it, all the way to the technologies that govern it, to the products that use that tech, to the experiences that are enabled by it, to the systems that hold it all in place, those things are all interconnected. And you can do design work in one of those layers. You can alter them. Like, your job may not be designer, but you may be somebody that works at your city municipality level. And what you build and create affects everything within it to some degree. And that's what we mean by interconnection, is how everything really does connect to everything else if you really expand out and zoom back in.
And again, this is one of those things where this is true even before this kind of technological moment in which we find ourselves, right? You say at one point, everything we make is a response to something and leaves something new to respond to. If life were a poem, each verse would be a response. In this way, the story of the world is written in replies, which I think is a fascinating. I don't know that I've thought about that all that much. I mean, I think I've thought about that a lot in terms of kind of the history of ideas, intellectual history, because you can't get away from it in that discipline without thinking about that. But I think in terms of the design world that you're pointing to, I had never really considered that, and that even our cities and structures and so forth is a product of that same kind of dynamic. So, Scott, you want to unpack any more of that?
Yeah, I think the other thing too is that we're just not, as humans, very good at seeing that stuff. Like, it's not a surprise that you haven't thought about it that way, because we tend to think in objects rather than relationships. I have a car, I live in a house, I'm sitting in a chair. And, I might think of my calendar, of my day, as something that sort of has a little bit of motion and connection. But we tend to not be able to see, well, how did that thing that I do, what were the repercussions of that thing? The thing that my ancestor did, how did that lead to where I am right now? In fact, I would say that like some of the arguments that people are having, say, politically, and I don't want to go too deep into that, they are about how important it is or isn't that things have cascaded. How much should we pay attention to what came before and how that led us here? And is that something we need to deal with or not? And, these are the fundamental arguments we're having, are about these interconnections.
Yeah. Yeah, nicely said. Taking this back then to the current moment, you quote Kathy O'Neill in her book, Weapons of Math Destruction. And she says, quote, "Algorithms don't just predict the future, they cause the future." Which I think, it's a terrifying sort of reality, I think, that we're beginning to deal with. But unpack that one a little bit more for us. Describe how this is, in fact, true.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it in the smallest ways, right? Like, so I wake up in the morning, I might look at my phone, in comes a text message that sends me down a certain path. Maybe I open an app. That app has a record of everything I've done, and it starts to serve me up certain things. Let's say it serves me up a video of a philosopher I'm interested in. Well, that's going to change how I think that day. So later on that day, I might be like, oh, I remember that little philosophy that I heard. That's affecting what I'm doing right now. In other situations, she points a lot to how crime, and I use crime in quotes, algorithms are actually based on arrest data, which is a more limited data set, right? A lot of crimes occur without being tracked. And so you get lopsided images of where crimes occur versus where arrests happen. When arrests are located in a particular area, policing goes up in that area, and then that leads to more arrests. So the algorithm that's sort of identifying quote unquote crime is actually identifying arrests, and then it's amplifying the arrests because it's pushing more policing toward the area with the arrest. The algorithms aren't just tracking what we're doing, they're actually changing how we respond to the world.
It's common in discussion on ethics and technology for a lot of people to use a so-called instrumental view of technology, where the metaphor that's typically used is they'll say that technology is like a tool. It's amoral. It's like a wrench. You can use a wrench to fix a widow lady's car, or you can use a wrench to bash her on the head and steal her purse. It's just amoral. It's how you use it. But along comes somebody like, and I mentioned this person to you before we started the show today, Jacques Ellul, and he suggests that while that kind of conversation about technology probably needs to be had typically, to what end are we using the technology, that there's another question of what he calls characterology. It's a really weird word. I mean, he's writing in French, so I don't know about the translation there, but it's translated in English, characterology. And so what he's doing is he's saying all technology is not simply like a tool, but it engenders a sort of character in us as individuals, and it engenders a sort of character in us as communities. And if we don't look at the character that's engendered in us by a given technology, we failed to even begin to sufficiently see what's going on. And, as I was reading your book, I thought, it's like you guys are doing the kind of stuff that Jacques Ellul would have been really pleased to see you do, because you're asking lots of questions about what kind of people are we becoming and what sorts of questions do we need to be asking ourselves about ourselves. So I don't know, any more commentary on what I said there about Ellul or anything else you want to unpack on that?
I love that idea of characterology. I think there's a directionality to all technology. I understand the desire to say that it's neutral, and I can even, make that argument. But there's you take a gun, which is the simplest one. If the goal of a gun is not to kill, it's at least to damage, right? Like the technology is kind of the valence of the technology is toward damage. And there's just no way around that. Now, you can use it to damage different things. You can use it for self-defense. You can use it for hunting. You can use it for murder. But it still has this directionality of damage. And I think it's very hard for some reason when it's not as obvious as that. So nuclear bomb, it's easy to see the directionality of that or the character of that. Social media was not so easy to see the character of that. But in retrospect, it's actually pretty obvious. Initially, social media is about moving information around. It feels like the character is about connecting. It's about sharing with friends. We add something to it, which is sort of this algorithmic sorting based on popularity and attention getting. And then it changes the character, but we don't notice. Obviously, that leads to, if you're looking at images of people's bodies, you're going to have body image issues. It's sort of obvious in retrospect, and it's kind of confusing as to why it's not obvious beforehand. And I think our hope is that we can get better at kind of identifying that character as the technology is coming to be, rather than sort of figuring it out after the damage happens.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with Carissa Carter and Scott Doorley of Stanford d.school. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in this episode, as well as a PDF of my complete interview notes and a full transcript. We would be delighted if you tell your friends about No Small Endeavor and invite them to join us on the podcast. because it helps extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world. Coming up, Carissa and Scott discuss how human emotion might play a crucial role in the tech design process, how the technology we use changes us inside and out, and the 4 practices they prescribe for interacting with and designing technology in a flourishing manner.
I'm Shankar Vedantam, here to tell you about a great mystery. That mystery is you. As the host of a podcast called Hidden Brain, I explore big questions about what it means to be human. Questions like, where do our emotions come from? Why do so many of us feel overwhelmed by modern life? How can we better understand the people around us? Discover your hidden brain. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
The next intangible you point to is feelings. And again, this was another kind of place I thought, and again, I think it's just me seeing things in your discipline that I've not spent really any time considering. But I think obviously kind of in the, what do we want to call them? Maybe more soft humanities, theology, philosophy, psychology. Obviously, you're going to think about emotions and you're going to think of feelings a lot. But here you are talking about feelings and emotions with regard to design. And at first I was just kind of scratching my head thinking, what? So I know this was fascinating to me as well. So introduce us to this idea.
There's a technology blogger named Om Malik, who's a reporter, and he talks about in 2014, this is well after Silicon Valley launches in the 70s. He's watching all the tech boom and bust of the .com and then all into the new media. And he basically says, we as technologists have no idea what we're doing to people's emotions. We just don't even think about it. And it's really true. And if you look at the history of the internet, over and over, it's sharing information, connecting information. It's all about data and information. And there's some sort of not seeing that actually, this is people that we're connecting with this information and each other. And people have emotions, and emotions just have this huge, huge oversized impact. There's research down at USC that shows that decisions can't be made without an emotional impulse. So long story, but a lot of research on people with brain injuries that look at when people don't have emotional capacity, they just really have a hard time making decisions, even if everything else seems fine. And then also that emotions and feelings, they inspire us to act, right? They inspire, if you think of all creation, they say necessity is the mother of invention. Well, yes, that's true, but that necessity then creates an emotion that then sparks an idea. And so really taking emotions into account, not just to manipulate, which a lot of people do, right? Advertising does a great job of taking emotions into account, for better or worse, but to actually inspire and to think about how the landscape that we're working on when we're in a media environment is not the planet, it's not the water, it's not the air, it's our minds. This is the environment that we're polluting, this is the environment that we're building infrastructure for. And we need to really take that into account. And it starts with emotions because we're such emotional creatures, really.
Carissa, any more on that?
Yeah, maybe I'll pose a question, which is if we did acknowledge how much emotions drive our gut reactions, what we then decided to build, how we react to things and other people in the world, how would we structure our lives differently if that was the case? So our book is peppered with a series of speculative fiction stories that pose moments in the future for readers to try on and see how you show up in this future story if these phenomena were to be extrapolated 10, 20 years from the present. And one of these really sits in this world of emotion where there's a world where our world leaders are chosen by their ability to be compassionate with others, not on their political agendas, not on their history as lawyers or attorneys or engineers or whatever that might be, but instead identified as at a young age for having a high compassion score, and that being the mark of somebody who could really lead people. So it's not a far leap from today's trends of really stressing social emotional learning in schools for kids, right? That's starting to be more of a through line and acknowledged. And we don't yet see that highly valued if you look at who our world leaders are. But what if we did? What kind of world would we be in?
Yeah, one of I forget the name of the story. Is it Lovebot?
Love Machine.
Love Machine. Yeah, Love Machine. It is in this sort of story about a character who has some sort of chatbot perhaps embedded in his mind, but in some way it's whispering to him by some means how to talk in a way that ought to engender relationship with a love interest. It's a fascinating story because what we see so quickly, at least what this story imagines that resonates with me, is that we can try so hard to have a technique to do something that a technology can facilitate, but what it's doing is it's robbing us of our humanity. And what we think is going to help us connect with somebody else instead engenders severe separation because we want to have relationship with people who are authentically human, right? Not just parroting whatever it is a really, really smart romance bot might be telling us to do. Another thing that story raises is, and this goes back to Aristotle's stuff, they'll talk about the difference between continence and the encratic. And so the continence is that you have a capacity to hold something or not do something, but it's just this kind of superficial capacity. Whereas the encratic is where your character has really been formed in a certain way that you have the internal capacity, the training, the embodiment, the habits, the virtues that enable you to act in a certain way, right? So I think that story exhibits that perfectly, right? So there's sort of continence, if you will, that keeps you from saying a certain thing that you shouldn't say and prompts you to say a certain thing that it thinks you should say, but the internal formation of the self hasn't occurred, and it's just so off-putting. And again, you're pointing us to these kinds of questions that we generally, I think, are not asking of ourselves, but are so important. So I don't know, Scott, since you wrote that story, any other comments on that?
Well, I think the way you're framing that there is exactly right. And to go back to what you were talking about with the instrumentalism, if we have that view that all these technologies are a tool, and when we use a tool, we're kind of offloading something that we do to that tool. So like if I drive a car, I'm offloading my motion to the car. If I, use a calculator, I'm offloading my ability to compute. I think we need to be really careful about what we're offloading. Like I might be okay offloading my sense of direction because, the maps just make it so easy to traverse through the world that I can think about other things. I can pay attention to my kids rather than trying to find directions. Maybe I'm okay with that. But am I okay with offloading my creativity to, a generative AI that can write? Maybe in cases where I don't feel like that creativity is really core to my being, maybe that's okay. But in other cases, maybe not. And I think as we just say, tool to fix problem, we forget what the core is that we've developed to work on that problem and what we're losing, what we're offloading from our character. I mean, the idea encratic is the core character, right? Right. The idea that I don't think we pay attention to the encratic part that much until it's gone. And then you're like, oh, wait a minute, I didn't want to lose that.
Yeah, nicely said.
I mean, there's also, if I could just build even beyond that, Scott mentioned the maps example. There's research that shows it's not just our character that might be adjusted, but our hippocampus has shrunk. If you never use your sense of direction, that affects the actual structure of your brain. And are we okay with that too? I think that when we're talking now about offloading that creativity or other characteristics that we might be asking machines to do, both for our characters and our psyches, but also our bodies, is that actually having physiological changes that could be harmful down the line?
Yeah, well said. So let's move then to part 2, in which you call us to what you call actionables to unmake runaway design. I was reminded of the phrase from a lot of contemporary Judaism, tikkun olam, which is just to repair the world. That's what you're calling us to, right? That in design work, let us not ignore all of these intangibles that we too often ignore and set out intentionally to design healing or design repair into our designs, knowing the tendencies that we have not to see things fully or knowing the tendency that we have that everything's going to be imperfect. I love that sort of hopeful vision that you're setting for us here. There's really serious problems to be addressed, but there's possibilities to go forward. So let me ask this question first. And was the kind of hopeful piece there for you from the beginning, or did you begin with just this kind of diagnostic critique piece? How did you come to this sort of diagnostic plus hopeful element that you wanted to try to hold together?
The impetus of the book was really what's going on. And forget bad actors. I mean, bad actors are important to deal with, but there are a lot of people with really good intentions creating a lot of stuff that's working in some ways and then not really working at all in others. Particularly as time goes on, it starts to reveal that, oh, that thing that kind of worked for a little while, now it's not working. And so it just began with this question of like, what is going on here? Why do good intentions not lead to perfect outcomes, say? If everybody is dreaming of utopias, why aren't we living in one? And of course, there are a lot of reasons for that. There are systemic reasons, but we decided to sort of focus on just internally as people who are creating, what are the things? And that's where the intangibles came out. And then I think along the way in that hair pulling, throwing things away kind of situation, we started to realize that there is a perspective, particularly you see it here in Silicon Valley, where we are in spades, where it's like, it's about breakthrough, disruption. We're going to create the new thing. It's going to cancel everything that came before it. It's all progress. And again, not against that. Totally, there are great things that come of that because some things do need to be disrupted, frankly. But that's only one way to think about creativity. So there's some wonderful research about differences in culture in China, north and south of the Yangtze River. And just to sum it up, there's evidence through numbers of patents, divorce filings, psychological studies, that the North is much more independent. It's much more this breakthrough kind of Silicon Valley style. And that the South, the creativity is much more sort of communal and adaptive. And how can we work together? How can we bring things together? Their theory is that that maps to the crops that they grew hundreds of years ago. The North was wheat, which you can grow much more independently. The South was rice, which requires a lot more coordination with your neighbors to share water. For me, in particular, it crystallized something that Chris and I were talking about, which was maybe the motivation of design should be to bring things together and not sort of disrupt and break through and tear things apart. The same skills can be used to heal things that are used to kind of transcend them or get beyond them. So it's just a slightly different perspective, but it is quite different. We have some stories in there where people have good intentions and it doesn't always go great because they're not about creating harmony. They're about kind of solving a single problem.
We're going to take a short break, but coming right up, noticing, shape-shifting, disorienting, and imperfection. The 4 practices Carissa and Scott prescribe for new possibilities in design work. Hey there! Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. So these 4 practices then that you prescribe for us as a way to practice this sort of approach to design. First one, be awkward. You called it one point practicing noticing. And I was struck by this because I think one of the recurring motifs that we hear from so many of our guests from a great number of disciplines is this lost art of simply learning to pay attention and practicing noticing. Tell us a little bit about how you see that being crucial in this project.
Design is really about seeing the unseen, right? Being able to take in the data you have around you, how people are feeling, like pulling together disparate kinds of information and making sense of it to fill a gap that we may not even have known existed. And one example that we have in the book about this is about naming your monsters. And what we mean by that is if you think about monsters that you may envision on old maps from the 1500s, you may have seen like a fantastical looking creature drawn on one of these old maps. But let's think about what device that monster has. So that map says, here's everything we know about this area. So when you see a monster on there, what it's showing you is that there was likely a group of people on a ship that saw a fin go by or saw a spout of water, but they didn't see the whole creature. They don't know what that is. They just know that there's something there. That monster is a mix of something that is unknown and something that was seen. There may be something scary about that, but by putting that on the map in its monster shape, it's keeping it in the public psyche. It's keeping it there for somebody else to work on and take a step further. So we like to have people do an exercise where we ask them to draw the monster in their own work today. What would that monster look like? And Scott and I both have our own sketched monsters, and we urge you to try it too. What would it look like? What do you notice is happening in the world, but you're also kind of secretly terrified for, and you want to have a conversation about it?
Let's go to the next one, shape shift. Keep changing, even if it slows you down. What's this one about?
Shapeshifting is really about being able to see what you're missing. So that chapter begins with a great example about monoculture and how bananas over time are really the same banana. When the bananas that we eat in the grocery store, they're the same banana. And in fact, they were the same different banana a little while ago. But that banana got a disease that basically wiped it out. So we just replaced it with a new same banana, which is then susceptible to a new version of that disease, which could be close to wiping it out. And the idea that really we need to be able to live in diversity, because diversity is a strength, right? It will protect against, that virus spreading, because if you've got different types, it's harder to kind of collapse the whole thing. And also that we really, we talk about this in the first part of the book, but we really don't have a view of the whole world. There's so many different ways in which we as individuals or even as groups just can't see everything the way it is. And that can be very effective. It allows us to move through life. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but we always have to be aware that we're missing something. So shape-shifting is really just a series of techniques that allows you to change the way you're thinking, change your frame of mind so that you can be active about trying to figure out what you're missing. It's not about getting things right. It's more about not getting things as wrong.
For potential readers, I'll just say you give a lot of practical ways one might go about doing this, and exercises or different sorts of ways to think about this. The next one, disorient yourself. Let go even if you lose control. Talk to us about this one.
Yeah, with disorientation, right, it's interesting to think about turbulence. And again, in the beginning of the book, we talk about flow in a river. And the reality is almost all flows of water are turbulent. They bubble and they boil. They're not organized. Yet, as humans, we try to organize most everything. But life isn't that way. We try to control things within ourselves. If you feel panicked, you try to take big breaths or you practice yoga, right? But we also try to control the systems in our lives, supply chain systems, like your Amazon package is prepared in a hyper organized warehouse and it gets to you just absolutely instantly, right? But then you have a pandemic and something's affected with how that supply chain works, right? And we're shocked into chaos. Right. So with disorientation, it's all about understanding what are we aiming for? What are we not aiming for? There's a great section within this chapter about goals and anti-goals and being able to articulate one or the other. And are there helpful tools there to help us understand what does the system look like? What does it look like when it's turbulent? What type of organization or chaos? How do we handle that? But then also very simple techniques like being able to say, I'm going to commit to not doing this. And that sometimes is a better goal than trying to be perfect, is just to aim for, here's what I don't want to occur. It's a different way to embody your ethics of a situation.
Yeah. And you also have a distinction there, not only between goals and anti-goals, but between goals and purpose. I think maybe the way you put that, which I think is really important distinction as well, that can there be these sort of objectives or goals But the larger, more pressing concern is really what's the purpose of maybe something that we're designing, or more, what's the purpose of being human, right? And how do we let our implicit or explicit notions of the purpose of what it means to be human inform all of this? But Scott, any commentary on that distinction between goals and purpose?
Yeah, specifically, there's a concern when the measurement becomes the purpose. So let's say I'm trying to, I don't know, build my audience on social media, and I'm going to say, I want 100 likes. Well, if I start to make that measurement should be evidence of the fact that I'm connecting with my audience, which would be the purpose. But if I start to just think about 100 likes, the purpose totally vanishes, because now I'm going to do whatever I need to do to reach the goal. The sense of purpose is completely gone. And that's where things can really go awry, because you're trying to hit these goals, you're trying to hit these measurements, but you're not doing it in service of the thing that you started out to do.
Yeah. One practice that you give us in this chapter, this notion of just kind of deliberately drifting, which I really love. One of the ways I have done this a lot through the years is if I get to travel, especially if I get to spend an extended period of time in a city. Like, I think the first time I really realized I was doing this years ago, I was working on a writing project, and I was in Jerusalem for like 3 weeks. I was staying at a study institute out near Bethlehem, so I'd hop on a bus and go downtown at typically around sunset, and I would just wander for hours through the old city of Jerusalem and just get lost. I wouldn't know where I was, but I figured I could find my way out at some point. Didn't have a phone with GPS on it or anything. And I would just wander and wander. And I've realized through the years that as I've done that in other major world cities, I just see things and learn things I would never see or learn or know. But it only comes through this deliberate practice of getting disoriented. So I'd love to see your endorsement of that here in this chapter.
Oh, yeah. One thing to say about that is it's so simple to do, even in your own backyard, right? You don't even have to travel. And it's often even more revelatory if you do it out your front door. And the way to do that is walk outside and tell yourself that you're going to follow a color. Okay. And maybe it's that blue that I see in the water bottle that the person that's across the street is carrying. And I'm going to just walk towards blue. And when I get close enough, I'm going to notice that other blue that pops out in the corner of your eye, and just allow yourself to follow the color. And you will be able to do it. Set a timer for 30 minutes and see where you land. And we send our students on these drifts quite often because it challenges your assumptions of a place. When you're in a place all the time, you stop noticing what's in your peripheral vision. When you go on a drift, derive is the form it comes from Guy Debord in the psychogeography movement. Like, when you go on that drift, that derive, wow, you see your regular surroundings in an entirely different way. And it makes you just heighten every sense of noticing that you have.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I'm going to have to try to follow the color. Let's go to the fourth one. Aim for imperfection, don't fix everything. And you begin that chapter with a quote from Paul Virilio, who says, "When you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck." That's kind of another major way, perhaps, to summarize at least the diagnostic piece of your book, right? Is that we're not paying attention to the fact that when you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck. So let's at least begin to kind of think about that. But talk to us about this aim for imperfection.
Yeah, I think as you write a book, you kind of start to form convictions. And I have to say, the one thing that's come out of this book that's been a surprise to me is I'm starting to become anti-utopias, because it's just a completely flawed idea that we're going to get everything perfect. There's absolutely no evidence, despite many tries, that, we could come up with some system that's just going to make everything right. And yet, for some reason, when we create things, we kind of feel like that's what we're doing. Oh, I'm going to create this and it's going to solve the problem and everything's going to be great. I even do that to this day, even having these convictions. And so what we realized toward the end of the book there is that really the goal should be imperfection, because that's where we're going to land. So if you're thinking about, oh, my outcome is going to have good things and bad things, part of my design is going to be the great things that come out of this, the solutions that I put into the universe. And part of it's going to be the tricky things that then creates, because I've now put something into a system that's very dynamic. And of course, it's going to perturb other things, and that's going to create other cascading impacts. So when you're thinking about not trying to get things right, but trying to bring things into harmony, sort of trying to have this sort of a good imperfection, you're open to adapting to the things, to the shipwrecks that come, right?
Yeah. I don't hear you saying because we know everything is imperfect, we're off the hook for the imperfections, but instead, quite the contrary. It's because we know that everything's imperfect, then take seriously the potential damage that may come in the wake of our design, and then at least try to consider possible mitigation, and in some cases, maybe simply not doing it, right? Not designing it or not going down a particular path. Is that right?
Yeah, like understand the constraints within the system you're building in. And part of your work should be about how you're going to respond when things go awry. And how we make that response both in the near term and the longer term, like I think that's really the question of this age.
That can be, can sound sort of defeatist maybe or negative, but it's actually a very positive thing. Like, how can we bring things into the world that we can be proud of, that we're happy to have exist, that we know is, as good as we can do? And I would say our students increasingly come in with that attitude. They don't just want to put something new and big into the world. They want to put something into the world that's going to have a great impact. And they're open to the fact that some of the things they make might not work that way. And they're happy to work on designing those issues into the design itself.
Yeah. So in the few minutes we have left, let's talk about the call to action that you close the book with as well for listeners. What kind of practicalities? I'm sure we have some folks who are listening who are designers, but a lot of people who don't think of themselves as designers. So what kind of practicalities would you leave us with about how to employ your insights here?
I think one of the big ones is that it can always feel like in a world, we're calling it runaway design, which feels a little bit out of control, that everything's just happening to us. And that we're not the ones we're actually just experiencing this and we're going to have to deal with it. And of course, you can't be naive. That is true. However, we're the ones who experience the impacts. We're far more expert on what this is doing to us, all these new technologies, than even the people creating them, who are very excited and kind of almost clouded by the potential that they have. So one is to say, the feelings that you have, you should express them, share them just in conversation with people so we can collectively have discussions about what we want to do, what we don't want to do, what our sense of purpose is, not just what the measurements and the goals are. And then two is to know that actually, if you think about it, we're all creating the future. We live in the present, but the present creates the future. And so even the smallest changes at a grand scale can have a huge impact. So we actually do have more influence, maybe not over what technology is coming to be, but definitely over how we want to put it to use.
I'll add, one of our big takeaway messages is we say, be a good jig of the world. The jig being the device that holds the piece of wood or metal that you then can shape. You don't always have to be the feature, but how you ask questions of what's happening is important. How you react, your emotional response, the fact that you might acknowledge what that monster is. That's all ways that you are being a good jig about what's around you. And it's very doable, as Scott was saying, even if you are not the technologist, we need you and your insight and your lens as a parent, as somebody that plans meetings, as somebody that was elected to town council. We need you questioning even the most technical of our technologies. Even if you don't feel like you're the coder, you got to be talking about what that code can and might do for the realm that you work in, that that is really, really important.
Been talking to Carissa Carter, Scott Doorley from the Stanford D.school, discussing their recent book entitled Assembling Tomorrow, A Guide to Designing a Thriving Future. Carissa and Scott, thanks so much for your great work, and thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having us, Lee.
Thank you, Lee.
You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with Carissa Carter and Scott Doorley, faculty at the Stanford D.school and authors of the new book Assembling Tomorrow, A Guide to Designing a Thriving Future. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
Hey there, Jacob Lewis here, executive producer of the show, as well as co-host of all of the bonus material that you will hear with Lee on No Small Endeavor Plus. And I just wanted to chime in and share a little taste of our conversation we had recently with songwriter Andy Gullahorn. So the context here is that on NSE Plus, all those bonus episodes, rather than talk about the good life, we conduct experiments with a guest derived from our many interviews that Lee has had with amazing people over the years. And this month, we tackled climate change, and we've assigned singer-songwriter Andy Gullahorn the task of making a climate action Venn diagram. This is derived from our interview with Dr. Ayanna Johnson. And then he's got to take some sort of action toward what he comes up with on that climate Venn diagram. Here's a little taste of that conversation.
Did you ever interview Peter Harris?
Yeah.
yeah.
Like getting to know Peter over the years. I was thinking about that when you're talking about, he talks about doing climate work is like sitting with a dying friend and asking, you're saying having both feet firmly and like, yeah, there's some serious stuff that is happening here, but is there still something beautiful? Like if there wasn't a way to completely change all the damage that has been done, is it still worth loving? So getting to be around people like that who ask those kinds of questions, and I just get to learn from them.
Yeah.
All right, that was just a snippet of our NSE Plus conversation. If you want to hear the whole episode, right now, go to nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSE Plus.